And here's Melissa is going to talk a little bit about her piece first, and then be showing us her app/exhibit touch interface all at the same time. So without further ado, Melissa Rockwerk's BFA.
Good morning. My name, as Tom said already, is Melissa Rockwerk. I am a senior biomedical thesis candidate, and welcome to the Illuminated skull specimen. This project started with a deep passion for the human skeletal system and an insatiable inspiration for the Museum of Natural History experience. My goal was to find a way to inspire other people to become more informed about their own human skeletal structures without necessarily having a higher scientific background. With this in mind, I decided to develop an engaging and educational product designed to inform the public audience about the complexities and fragilities of their own human skull, without necessarily having a higher scientific vocabulary. In response to this challenge, I met with the Cleveland Museum of Natural History's Physical Anthropology Collections Manager, Lyman Jalema, who hopefully will be here at one point, almost a year ago. Enamored by Mr. Jalema's experimental photographs of illuminated skull specimens, affectionately named pumpkin skulls, I knew that this particular visual could be instrumental in informal scientific education. The next few months were spent in the physical anthropology lab experimenting with different procedures to illuminate the human skull specimen and photographing the specimen in variously lit environments. Once these trials produced favorable results, the next challenge was to create a functionally educational yet engaging exhibit to show off these photographs. The Illuminated Skull Specimen, an iOS and internet-compatible module, features a digital, horizontally rotatable human skull lit from within the cranial vault. While light travels through the organic structures of bone tissue, it creates a warm chroma palette which clearly delineates bone density variation. A chroma density key, shown here, and also located to the left of the skull rotatable within the module, clearly delineates the colors that you see in the skull in millimeter increments, directly corresponding with bone density. The rotatable skull also provides the viewer with 4 density points, or areas with the lowest bone density on the skull with which to choose from. These points, if chosen, provide illustrations detailing either a comminuted or depressed cranial fracture implemented in that area. The goal is to provide a viewer equally with information about the human skull's organic variation of bone density and how severe fractures in weaker areas might affect a person's underlying brain. Created with the Museum of Natural History in mind, this module is designed as a standalone exhibit in which a viewer or a group may interact with and navigate through the module. Starting from the home screen, a viewer may choose between 4 sections: the module key or instructions, the credits, the illuminated skull specimen, or the bone locator tool. The module element key briefly explains the function of each important element within the module. It also provides visual examples of each element with its description so a viewer may understand in advance how each feature operates. This page is accessible from anywhere within the module, just in case. The bone locator tool features 7 views of specimen 2890 from which a viewer may also choose. Once selected, each view will provide a choice of bones to locate, as well as a fully lit photograph and a line overlay which delineates each individual bone within the skull. From any of these pages, the main illuminated specimen may be accessed. As the main feature of this module, this page has exclusive access to all other visual information regarding skull fractures through density point buttons and 3D bone models through the bone selection buttons below. Up here would be the density point selection buttons, and they're also labeled on the skull. And on the bottom, there would be 3 different buttons for temporal, frontal, and parietal bones that show up as the skull rotates and they show up in the view. While this exhibit does not attempt to promote a certain health protocol, such as wearing helmets or not riding motorcycles, it does provide an audience with a unique representation of the human cranium that might allow them to understand their skull in a new way. This exhibit sheds light onto the concept of bone as a dense, rigid structure, and it provides a general audience with visual information that their skull is more fragile than they might realize. Furthermore, what could potentially happen to their skull if it's not adequately protected? The Illuminated Skull Specimen seeks to visually inspire while engaging to educate. I am seeking to inspire an audience about the new representation of their unseen anatomy. And I can go through it. I can open it up to you guys.
Go through it first.
Okay. As you guys saw the home screen here, you saw the element module key, the bone locator. I can show you an example of how this would work. So each skull is equipped, like I said, with a fully photographic view of specimen 2890. Every view also has a selection of bones that are available within the view, so that a viewer might be able to find where these bones are before heading over to the main illuminated module. With each view of the specimen, there's also a complete line view which delineates each bone from the skull, because sometimes they can be kind of hard to see where the sutures meet with each other, where is the frontal bone in relation to the parietal bone, and where do you find that edge. So this would hopefully show a viewer before they get into the main illuminated specimen what they're dealing with the skull if they're not familiar with it already. The main illuminated module has buttons on the side from which you can rotate the skull. And as I said before, the density points on top, which are labeled on the skull here, so you can see where each point is coming from. If I were to click on point number 4, which you see is here in the parietal zone, I would be led to two different choices, one for a comminuted and a depressed fracture, which are two very severe fractures. If I were to click on one, sorry, my screen is purple, just so everyone knows. The module is not purple, so if you want to take a look at it afterwards, you can see the real colors. But every fracture selection has different fracture illustrations that can show a viewer kind of how, if the bone were broken, where it would implement on the brain, where it would affect the brain, and in each caption it would tell a viewer which lobe of the brain would be affected, and give a very, very brief synopsis of what that lobe does. So for the frontal lobe, it's responsible mostly for a person's personality, logic, rationality. So if that lobe were affected by a severe fracture, these are things that might possibly be impaired. There are 4 density points that show up as the skull rotates, so as they come into view, they become available. There are also 3 bone buttons, as I explained before. So I just tapped on the frontal bone. The animations take a second. But there are 3 generalized models of each bone that's available with a pause and a play button, just so you can take a look at them. And all of these bones and density points are only available through the skull specimen, because that's where you kind of need that orientation to figure out where you're going. And also from this page, the module key, the instructions, and the bone locator are available just in case. And we have a credit screen. So the premise of this, as I said, is to be a Museum of Natural History exhibit. If this were in a Museum of Natural History, it would be by itself. It wouldn't have anything else around it. It would be so that a viewer could walk up to it and explore within the module without having any other information necessary. The goal is to provide every human being with the same information about their own body without necessarily having them take a higher scientific class like anatomy or histology or going to med school. I feel that this is important because we should all understand how our brain works, and we should all understand that our skull is not in itself a helmet for our brain. Rather, we should protect it because it is fragile. So with that, I will open it up to you guys, and if you want to see anything else, just let me know.
So from the beginning of the project, we've gone through quite a few iterations of the overall point of these. and where it is right now. Can you talk a little about what your initial findings were, where you initially thought this was? First, it was going to be almost like a public education piece on young motor science.
Yeah.
So how did it get from there to where it is right now?
Well, originally back in August, I was really inspired always with the human skeletal system and the skull in particular. And because I knew that it was a lot more fragile than a lot of people realize, I almost wanted to make it an exhibit about how people should protect the brain. But then I ran into a lot of problems with, should I be telling people not to ride a motorcycle? Should I be implementing a helmet law? And I started to do a lot of research and looked at a lot of statistics on helmets, whether or not they actually do affect the fatality rate if you were in an accident, if you were in a car accident, if you were in a bike accident. And the numbers, while they were convincing, while they did show that they did help, were not convincing enough to me to make an entire year-long project about wearing helmets. The evidence just wasn't substantial enough to me. Could have been a personal choice, but that's how I felt that I needed to broaden the topic a little bit. And then I figured that it would be a lot easier to simply educate people using visuals about their skull, allowing them to make their own decision. So with that in mind, I still stuck with the illuminated skull because I thought that was the best way to show people without telling them this is how fragile your skull is. And it's kind of the same premise if you were to put a flashlight up to the back of your hand and you can see, it turns red and there's parts where you see your bone and it's darker. So it's the same premise as that. And I feel that that's such a common thing that a lot of probably done in their life, their hand up to the light. And that was the visual that spoke the most to me, and I felt that that was the most important to get across rather than just wearing helmets or telling people how to live their lives. I wanted them to make that choice for themselves. Yeah.
Do you see this as expanded into potential nutrition or medical use, whereby you're either studying other countries where you've seen skulls that say, this population has predominant dense region in the skull here or there, and correlating with a medical disease or injury, and also in order to build up the nutrition or strengthening of the skull? I mean, do you see a medical?
Yes, actually, there are medical applications for this, and I have actually talked to a lot of people that are either in med school or going into med school throughout the last year or so, and they said it would be very helpful to see this. With this project in particular, this is actually all one skull. This is one human skull from America. So it's not really the best example of all skulls all over the world. If this project were expanded, we would need at least a couple hundred different skulls from different locations, different regions, different races, because the density of the skull actually is affected a lot by where someone lives, the temperature. If someone lives in a warm environment as opposed to a cold environment, their skull density actually will vary. So, needless to say, men or women, different races will all have slightly different bone structures. So if this were expanded, it would be really interesting to do different regional projects with different skulls. So maybe 100 skulls from one region and 100 from another to really get a sense of where these similarities and differences are.
And diet?
And diet, yes, diet does affect. Pretty much most environmental factors and things that you put into your body will affect the makeup of your bones because they really do reflect what you put into your body. Does that answer?
Okay. This is on Beth's point here too. Can you tell us a little bit about why you decided to do this specific specimen, like why you didn't try to do like a normal versus abnormal versus the specimen, so you could show us comparisons so we get a sense of, that this is a very specific skull with a very specific history, very specific anatomical landmarks, fractures, densities, that it doesn't represent sort of the cardinal normal skull or more normal, quote-unquote normal characteristic skull from the collection. So why this skull, and why specifically did you choose this in terms of making the program around, and why you didn't do a normal comparison?
Right. Well, actually, this skull, other than the fact that I did have access to it at the very beginning of last year, it didn't actually have any particular diseases or fractures. Like a lot of their skulls have really beautiful fractures, like comminuted and depressed, and some of them have, trauma that happened in the skull, and they're really broken up into pieces. This one was actually, other than his teeth, all still in one place. So it is a Caucasian male. That's about all I can tell you about him. But for the sake of time, there wasn't enough time to really photograph multiple skulls. That would be the next step in this project, is to photograph maybe 10 more Caucasian males and maybe 10 Caucasian females, just to get that one group, and then to branch out from there. For the sake of time though, and to keep it specific to one specimen, I really did focus on him. But that would be my immediate next step.
I have a follow-up to that. The section with the fracture, can you go to the section for a second?
Is there a preference?
Yeah, just go, yeah, that's fine. Did you think that maybe, because I like adding a piece of information that could sort of talk about sort of the thinness of the skull, the different types of fractures. Did you think maybe your audience, because they're a lay audience and they're coming to the museum and they're looking at this specific skull, did you think maybe they could link that skull to having these fractures when they look at this page?
Quite possibly. I
It
want
sort
to
of mislead them for them looking for the fractures that you're sort of calling out?
Yeah, I mean, I did want to give them a sense that the skull is whole, so that's why I added in the bone locator tool fully lit views of this skull, so people had this illuminated view, but they could also see the outside of the bone. They could see that it wasn't the hair itself.
But you said it might be misleading, or
Yes.
they might be like,
Yes.
oh, this specimen has a specific
And then
fracture,
go
let
back
me
to
look,
it.
let me learn about it, and then
Right.
where is that fracture? Because in one way, like I knew that was a skull that had these normal landmarks, but then I'm thinking about the instructional design of relating the fracture to it, and I think it's a great piece of information to say, you have to protect your skull, these all these health applications, but it could mislead you that the specimen that you chose is characteristic of an example of these
Of
types
these
of fractures, right?
Right.
So that's just a point of clarification that you may want to make either in the program or include a skull that may
Definitely.
have these fractures as an
Yeah, as a
orientation.
comparison.
Because that was my other point with this, is that I appreciate the sort of the stylization of the fractures, but I need to see an orientation of where these fractures occur.
Okay.
So I can see sort of the whole skull and then relate it back to the normal skull.
Right.
Make sense?
Totally, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it is interesting. You're coming at this from after you did the research into the accidents and protection. You concluded that this would just be sort of a purely informational, knowledge-based
Yeah.
project. But don't you think that people will draw conclusions, and that they're gonna, it seems to me that when they finally get round to the end of this, and if they go through interactively through the steps, they're gonna want to draw some conclusions about their
Right.
own skull and protecting their own skull.
Yeah.
And when you and I talked quite a bit about this, what you didn't include in the little discussion we had here today is the fact that the thing that really is of concern is people drinking and driving,
Yeah.
drinking and driving at night.
Right. I mean, that's a concern of mine, and what I decided kind of in November, October area, maybe even a little bit later than that, is that I didn't necessarily want to put that on anyone else. I didn't want that to be the message my audience got was, oh, she's telling me not to do this or not to do that. I felt like the information might be more absorbed by an audience if they were, like you said, allowed to draw those conclusions for themselves. So if they're looking at this and they're going through and they're saying, wow, my skull is actually really fragile, maybe I should rethink that decision of, going out and riding my bike late at night after I drink.
I guess but here's what I'm asking you. If I was a viewer of this, I would think, okay, how fast do I have to be driving to get a convoluted, seriously, or
Yeah.
what sort of accident,
Yeah,
what kind of impact causes that area of the skull to
Hammer.
fracture in that way?
Hammer would too.
Yeah, and
And I
honestly,
would, when you say draw conclusions,
yeah.
I think it's a beautiful project. I don't want to sound like
That's okay.
I'm just only being critical, but I just think that without statistics or I don't know what sort of conclusions one can really draw, aside from just sort of having the knowledge.
Right. Well, I mean, just 1 second.
Go ahead.
In terms of the fractures, I mean, how you would get them, it actually really depends. I mean, the best way to get a comminuted fracture is a small blunt object going at a strong force. It's actually, contrary to popular belief, it's not a larger object that'll give you that fracture. It's a smaller object because the force is implemented in a smaller area. If you have a larger object, like let's say somebody conked you over the head with a board, that board is putting the force across that entire piece of wood. But if someone were to conk you on the head with a hammer, all of that force is going into that smaller space.
Yeah.
So it would really depend. I mean, you could have two people driving motorcycles together at night, which is actually the most common time for people to get into fatal accidents at night by themselves on the road. And both of those people could hit the same tree, and if they hit it at a different spot, they could have completely different injuries. So for me, as much as I wanted to tell people, you know, this is how you get this one, this is how you get that one, it really depends on the circumstances. It depends on where did you hit your head on the pavement, where did you hit your head on the tree, where on the brain did that happen. And what I'm trying to show people with the illuminated skull is that when it's illuminated and you see these different areas here where it's darker, these are higher density points on the skull that actually act as a cage. The cranial vault is actually made up as almost an organic cage. So there are areas on the skull that are lighter and then are stronger around the side that kind of protect those lighter areas. But if you were to hit your head here as opposed to there, it could make a huge difference. And you could hit that same tree, and it really just, it depends on that impact.
This is on Rita's point, because I think you're, again, this is a great project, so I don't want to sound critical, but I think the idea here, or I can ask the question is, you do a specific technique where you overlay on the illuminated skull, or on the main skull, the different bone, the different suture lines and the different bones.
Right.
Teach us that. Do you think that because we're in need of a summary, sort of, we kind of need that summary takeaway as the patient or as the visitor, that this information, even right here, is if I'm going to the Museum of Natural History and I was a kid and they handed me the iPad, I'd be like, well, it's pretty colors, right? But if you had to sort of boil it down to a summary slide, or maybe 3 slides that kind of show, would you then take the illuminated skull and its density points and create an overlay of the most common areas for fractures?
Yes.
Do you see what I'm saying? Where you would actually take a view, call out this area, this is a weak point, these are the types of fractures. This is another weak point, these are the types of fractures. So instead of saying don't drive, don't get hit in the head with a hammer, those kinds of things, make a summary instructional design point that says, here I pointed out for all this time the anatomy really well, the weak points through light density, but now here's the big wrap up where I take away both the anatomy and the weak points, and I point out the weak areas.
Right.
And then I could, without being preachy, you can actually say that is a point. Is that something you've considered or noted that maybe having a summary could help us to draw conclusions?
I also, going along with that idea, I thought that maybe almost, if I had time for this would be a next step, almost an animation showing the illuminated skull, maybe bouncing off of something or showing that impact, and then showing somebody, this is how this could happen. And, maybe, it's a simple animation of the skull just dropped, or it's thrown, or something where you could see that impact, and a kid could say, wow, okay, that's how that happens, instead of just kind of, click a button and now it's broken. So they could actually see that process rather than just kind of having to conceptualize it. I think, sorry, Joyce was first.
Yeah, I did. Are you finished with the answer you were giving us? Okay. I just want to go a little further with this question because I guess my question to you would be, why did you decide to set up your exhibit in the way you did? Like walls, I understand that makes the skull not that far, but with the lights on the top, there's a whole different way that this probably would look if your intention had been to warn people about the use of helmets in specific situations, blah, blah, blah. There had been that kind of much more instructional purpose. So could talk a little bit, you have talked about the fact that this is intended for a public interface, right? But could you talk a little bit specifically about what, it's really less designed and more theater in a lot of ways, the experience of the exhibit.
Yeah.
Could you talk about your intentions for that audience in that way?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I really designed the exhibit with the museum in mind, and while the museum does not have Christmas lights, I wanted to kind of embody that whole experience when you go, say, into the space part of the exhibit, where everything kind of gets darker around, and then all of the exhibits kind of come out at you, and there's the sense of wonder that you get from going through the museum, where you're like, I want to, I need to explore that, I need to discover that for myself, and it kind of just comes out at you. So I envisioned that if this were in a museum of natural history, that this would be by itself. It would be a touch module where somebody could play and interact with it. But for the sake of this exhibit, I kind of wanted to create that sort of wondrous feeling of I'm going into this sort of learning cave, if you will, like into an environment. So if it were more health protocol centered, I probably would have, a helmet or a broken helmet and showing people like how that works. But for the sake of wanting to inspire people with knowledge and just get them to explore for themselves, I figured that this was more of a wondrous experience kind of thing. Can I answer my question? She's Maya.
No, you got to be friendly.
I know. I just wondered if you guys had any more questions.
I don't.
We have lots more questions.
So when you talk about the fractures, okay, you have one illustration there. I know you have others,
Yeah.
but in the one where you have the cross section, you show the brain. Okay, and one of the points that you make about showing this illuminated skull is the fragility of the skull, where these soft parts are. But then the underlying message there that the skull is fragile there, what is the skull there to protect? And then if this part is fragile, what's protecting it? It's protecting the brain there. Okay, if something happens to the brain, obviously catastrophic person. So why did you make the choice to not include the brain in other views? So like we have that side, the mid-sagittal view of the head there.
Right.
It's just the skull and we see the outside of the head.
Right.
There could potentially be a brain in there. There could potentially be a brain in some of the line art pieces. So why did you make the conscious decision to not include that in there? And just focus mainly on the skull?
Yeah, well, the project, for me at least, was mostly about the density and how the density could be correlated with those colors. And by putting a light in the skull, that was my premise, was to show people the density variation. And a takeaway from that for me is how that could affect the brain. So I didn't really want to focus as much on the brain throughout the entire project, as much as to inspire people throughout, the module, and then lead them somewhere as a takeaway. And then they say, oh, okay, there's a brain under there. Obviously for this particular view, the light bulb would be the brain, because there's nothing in there. But I really just wanted that to be a takeaway. So I kind of put that, you have to find your way to the brain, and then you're like, oh, okay, I didn't think about that necessarily, but that's a good thought. And then maybe let me see another fracture and, how other lobes might possibly be affected. So for me, it was more about the skull than the brain.
With that in mind, would you say it's not entirely so, but would you say a strong component of this piece is the aesthetic component of the illuminated skull?
Yes.
Everybody, I think everybody here sitting in the front row has the sense that they're very beautiful images. They're really nice, but they're neat to look at, especially with our audience.
Yeah.
I'm sure every one of us probably want a picture of an illuminated skull in our audience. But so would you agree that that's? Would you agree that that's a big component of this piece, is that it's the aesthetic?
Yes.
So there is that clinical, there is the educational component, but this is also partially an aesthetic piece.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
want
and
to show
that
this-
was very important to me, because my whole goal, my thesis, is to teach people visually, is not to teach people with medical jargon that they might not understand. I want everyone that's a business major, math major, a 10-year-old, 15-year-old who likes sports, anyone should be able to come up to this and through the visual information understand what's going on. So for me, yes, it is an aesthetically pleasing project that hopefully teaches.
Okay, in all this discussion, I think we're missing one thing.
Mhm.
This is a way to communicate to the general public the research that is going on currently in the museum. And while, yes, we are dealing with the, shall we say, the lay public that may not know all the fancy terms, there may be some people out there who would be interested in finding out what's going on. And maybe my hearing was off, but is there any way we could slip in something like, if you want to know more, I have a list of references at the end?
Yes, there is. In this particular module, I did not include my bibliography because those were my notes. I didn't include them for you guys, but if I were to expand this project, there would hopefully be, in addition to a section about how these fractures are implemented. So like I was saying about that, maybe somewhat of an animation or somewhat, an infographic about how these animations, how the fractures are implemented on the skull. I would also like to give a more informed viewer a little more information about this is how we came to this conclusion about the bone density. This is how we experimented with light in order to figure out where the organic composition of bone is thicker and lighter, and also what other projects could be taken off from this.
Okay. The other thing, maybe sort of an amicus curiae here for you who actually have a vote. This is a relatively new technique for transillumination. There are additional frequencies to be, electromagnetic frequencies to be investigated. I'm in contact with an engineer who's telling me that, gee whiz, if we could just get it a little bit lower into the reds and the infrared, then we'd be really pulling out some really interesting details. And I'm hoping that you're going to be around when he's around so we can all talk about this. Now, the other thing is that yes, time was limited and we've only dealt with one skull. But you see this cage-type formation, very interesting analogy. You see this cage-type formation. Is that the same in all skulls? I'm willing to guess that it isn't. And to document that, to see, all right, if we see a person with such and such attributes on the outside, is there any correlation to what is going on the inside? That we know, so that we would know before.
Right, and that would be the first next step after this project is, like I said, to broaden up the subject pool, to really understand. I mean, the concept of the cranial vault is universal, but as Lyman said, and as I've said before, every skull is organic based on the person, based on the region they're from, based on what they put in their body, based on every environmental factor you can think of can affect your skull composition because it is living. It's a living structure that depends on what you're putting into it and where you are in order to grow. And since your skull is actually, with the rest of your skeleton, growing and remodeling, pretty much every 7 years you have a new one, there are totally way too many different types of skulls that we could look at, different kinds of cranial vault structures that we could be looking at, and it would be really interesting to see, is there a regional difference? Is there a race difference? Is there men or women difference? Is there a huge difference between the cranial vault of a woman and the cranial vault of a man? And as Lyman was also saying, another project him and I have been working on is starting to look at different colored light, different wavelengths of light, and how those wavelengths travel through the skull as well. This is actually a cool LED light because we didn't want to add any extra warm light into the skull because as you can see it's a very warm color palette anyway. So we figured if we added more warm light it might disrupt the colors that you're seeing. So we specifically went with the cool LED light for this model, but what we've been starting to play with are different color lights, maybe a red or a blue, and which wavelengths of light travel through the bone composition differently. More, less, and why, based on the bone composition.
Right, this is on Lyman's point, so I think it was really great point that he just made about the specificity of the research going on in the museum. Now, call me kind of crazy if I throw this out, but you took a very specific skull from the museum and had this awesome, very specific method that you and Lyman really worked to develop. Why not make the app about the research? Why not turn this app into a very specific app about illuminating and different techniques of illumination of skulls and showing the examples and call it back to the Museum of Natural History, because that process those methods,
Yep.
these skulls, they're all specific, the different wavelengths of light.
Yep.
I mean, it's almost like you took a very specific idea and you put a generic frame on it, so
Yeah.
we could teach all, but what's
Right.
really interesting, what you're always fascinated in when I talk to you, is about the techniques that
Yeah.
you and Lyman came up with, and the positioning, the types of light, how it shows certain things, how it does it, and then the new research in that area. That is an exhibit in itself, without us even talking about what is my skull
Right.
have. Do you know what I'm saying? So if this was my project and I had the honor to work with Lyman with all of the different, trust me, I did not know how to illuminate the skull like you did, you both did. If it was my project, I would say, why not make it specific to the research at the Museum of Natural History and make it about the progression of the methodology,
Yeah.
the different types of illumination, and adding to that collection. So you now make a database
Right.
of different illuminated skulls that you can show to other museums and their methods to illuminate their skulls. And then by then, that product would be to teach
Right.
that methodology and also show something to the public about a really interesting new imaging technique.
Definitely. There's a very simple answer to that. We're still working on it. We're actually all the time still in the lab, still developing new ways to shine light through skulls. We're talking about actually other bones in the human skeletal system, how we can get lights maybe.
Do you see why
into-
that's your passion from
Yeah.
this BFA? It's not about like,
If this were a 5-year project, I
Okay.
would be doing that.
but even like if you
Yeah.
had to go back
Yes.
and you had to retool this application so it was your focused intention,
Right.
would it really be about the different fractures and the drunk drivers and this and that, or would it be about the methodology that you both created, that you created in the outcome of these different images? Because as Joyce said, it is kind of theatrical, but it is informational, but it's a specific type of information.
Definitely.
So if you look at this now and you see all this extra stuff you put into the app, would you put that in, or would you do it a different way now? Knowing what your passion is for this and where your audience might receive it.
Knowing that it was still 9 months, I would probably maybe add a few more skulls, but in
Would the
order,
focus be the same is what I'm
the
asking?
focus for 9-month project would be the same. Honestly, I mean, Lyman and I have been talking about so many different ideas that we want to do over the next long period of time that we really feel like that needed to be developed more. Like, we needed a why to why the cool LED works better than the warm light, or why the red light protrudes more through the skull than a blue light. We're still actually trying to figure that out, and we're talking with a couple of different people about, is it the collagen fibers of the bone composition that are stopping the light? Is it something else? So we're actually still working on that, and I think if I were to do this project again, if I had those answers, I would make the project about that. But I just felt personally that if I were to make that the point of my project and someone were to say, well, so why does that happen? Why is the cool LED light more effective? I feel like I would need a better, more informed answer at this point.
But do you think
So-
people present research without all the answers?
I mean, definitely not, but I felt like there could be a better answer. There could be a more informed answer. So if this was a year and a half, I probably would.
Do you think the process is enough of an answer to teach someone than having all the answers?
Sometimes yes, sometimes not. Depends on the situation. I mean, the process does help, but I would like to add to it. Because right now I understand why a cool LED light works as opposed to a blue light, but I couldn't tell you what part of the skull makes that work more effectively and why the blue light gets stopped. And that's what we're trying to figure out. So for the premise of this project, I would stay with, trying to teach people visually, but the next step of this project would definitely be to figure out why. Why does that happen?
And I agree with that, but what if people never got to the assumption that they could light the skull and see it with these different lights?
Then I would add it in here.
But do you know what I'm saying is like you're
somewhere,
going 1,000 miles down the road in a
Right.
very big collection, but if you were to really illuminate the research that was going on at the museum and also show an exhibit about it, you wouldn't need all the whys, because just the process, and from that process, the outcome would be teaching them about that process, and the byproduct would be the education about the skull. You make it more museum-centric to that collection, then you don't need the 1,000 miles down the road. You add to the app and new additions, or you create a database from it. So
Right.
that's what I'm trying to get you to see, is
Okay.
that what was the real focus of the app versus what is sort of what was added on in terms of, because Tom's right about the brain, is that I could have seen a lateral view, I didn't know that was the frontal lobe. It's like, it was kind of like, it was a little bit of like a Easter egg you put in there to get people to read more, but it wasn't really its focus, so why have it in there in the first place?
Yeah, well, I mean, density point 1 does correlate with the frontal bone, so that's kind of where, I mean, but it probably on that page should have said density point 1, frontal bone.
But when you get out of that page, you actually can't see where you are.
Right.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay, just an idea. It's a good project, and you guys have a lot more to do.
It's okay.
Yes.
So on the other side of this project, so there's a lot of technical aspects that go into this one. So obviously touch devices are the cool thing now, and it's everybody wants that especially in these type of institutions. It's probably the most intuitive way for visitors to interact with these type of exhibits. So can you speak a little bit about the process you had, why you chose the method you chose to display this? Was there other apps that are either at the Museum of Natural History that were inspiration to this?
Yeah.
Or is this something, did you basically start from scratch with the type of content and how you had to present it within this application? We won't call it an app, but it's
Yeah, app module.
right.
Well, up until actually December, I had about 600 photographs and no module. And my biggest challenge was finding a way to take all of that visual information and teach people with it in a way that was still engaging, rather than just showing them a collection of photographs and saying, okay, here you go. I wanted them to kind of explore through it and be able to rotate the skull and examine the skull for themselves. So there were actually a couple of modules at the Museum of Natural History now that Lyman and I took a walk through the museum and went through, and him and I have been looking up different apps throughout the internet. There's one on tectonic plates, and there's a whole bunch of different things that people are working with now to show people rather than tell people how things work. So that was really inspirational to me, and I didn't actually know, because I'm not a coder, I did not code this per se, but I didn't actually know that this was possible, but I was so inspired by that touch engaging interaction that I felt like if there was any way that I could possibly do that for people, that's what I wanted to do. So that's kind of where the interactive module came about, was the inspiration from the museum and playing with things and, pulling on the solar system and playing with planets and, that engaging interactivity that I felt is the cornerstone of the museum experience, especially for kids and their families and groups. And that's really when people start to internalize the information more, once it becomes more personalized for them, that they're able to make their own decisions. So rather than show people a photograph of the skull or say, this is this and it's because of this and that's just the way it is, I wanted to allow them to interact with the skull firsthand, and that way they could really take the knowledge and internalize it the way they felt that it was most important to them. So if they were going through it and they said, I don't really want to look at the bone locator tool, I want to go right to the skull, I want to see what happens if I click on density point 3 because that's really bright, and what would happen there. If I were to expand this, I would keep going with that premise of, maybe there's an animation that shows people how the frontal bone is impacted. Maybe there's an overlay here where you could click on it and it would show you the brain underneath before you go into the fracture implications. But the cornerstone for me of the museum experience was that interactivity and the play, because that's really where that sense of wonder comes from. So that's where the inspiration for the module came from. That's why I felt like that was important.
And then when making, a touch interface like this, I foresee probably within the major and throughout the school, lots of people probably want to create touch type interface. Right? So can you just speak a little bit to everybody about some of the guidelines that you have to follow to create, a touch interface device? In terms of, like what type of icons work, what don't work, what doesn't work. Placement of things, your graphic interface, your instructional design, how to lead the viewer there,
Well, other than taking interactive narratives a couple of years ago and learning kind of how modules are set up, and then doing a lot of trial and error with, what's the best way to get people to go to a home screen? Like, what's the best way to show people that this is a navigation bar? Like, what buttons are clickable, what buttons are not clickable? I did a lot of research with iOS modules. I did a lot of research on Apple, a lot of research with different companies that make those touch devices, just because, I mean, there's a lot of guidelines that they've already set up for how things work. And for the most part, they know what they're talking about. It does make sense. If you have a navigation bar, people see that and they're like, okay, that makes sense as a convention, because it's, all of them are going to be in this bar, and wherever you see that bar, that's a navigation. So a lot of the work was really working with those conventions. So at first I had buttons all over the place, and you really couldn't find them, and it was just kind of counterintuitive because you were playing on the bottom of the skull and then you'd have to go to the top to go back. So most of the trial and error of this project was making sure that it was easy for a reader to understand, or a viewer to understand those conventions of the module. So I think that's one of the most important parts, is really making sure that you have a system. So, I mean, the module obviously could look pretty much any way you want it to, but the most important part is having a system and a convention that a reader can understand. And that way they can navigate it without you being there to tell them, oh, click this to go there, click that to go there. And I mean, with the home, obviously you want to have a button that looks like home, even though mine apparently looks like a garage, as I've been told before. That is my home button. And for everything else, I had kind of strange buttons, and I was working on those up until the last minute, really, because they just never really seemed right enough. So at the end, my module key wasn't really just info, it wasn't just an information, but it was a key. That's how you figure out where things are. If you're lost, you look for the key. And if you're trying to locate bones, maybe you go to the compass because you're locating something. So you're trying to look for symbols that people can understand, like symbols that are, I don't want to say global, because symbols mean different things to different groups of people, but if I'm working with a general American audience, I'm hoping that general American audience can understand a key and what that might mean. So for me anyway, I'm working with a specific general audience, not necessarily global, but I tried to stick with conventions that I thought not only worked, but were proven and had worked before. So I looked at a lot of different modules too, and this is what I was happy with. Can I take other questions? Do you guys have any more questions? We can come back to you guys.
Maya has a question.
We can
open it up to everybody.
Okay.
So Tom asked a question about using interface in an exhibit and why you choose that medium. I was wondering, have you ever thought about the possibility of maybe, like, if you ever get really good at like something or something, you could add like a barcode and then you could scan it and take it home with them, like, so that it's distributed over time?
Yeah. Well, actually, at the very beginning stages of this, I really wanted to publish this, to put it on the Apple Store. There's a few more things I need to do in order for that to actually be legal, because I do not own this skull, and neither does the museum. It's actually owned by somebody else, so I need to get permission in order to do that first. But if this were, say, bought by the museum and they owned it and they had distribution license over it, then I would love to have a little barcode where people can click and then take it home with them and play with it more. It is actually phone mobile compatible for iOS right now, while you can't actually download it anywhere because I don't have the right to let you do that. It does work for pretty much every different device at the moment. Mostly iOS devices, but it does work on Android. I tested it last week, and it works on most tablets, and it does work on the web as well. So it has full compatibility to go wherever the viewer wants to take it. But it would have to be bought by the museum or someone that owns the property first.
It's just, Maya, is it?
Yes.
Yeah, that legal stuff can really trip you up, just to warn you guys.
Yeah.
Watch
I
out.
didn't mess with that. No. Didn't feel like messing with that. That is true. Do you have a question? Yeah.
So, for your research, did you consider combine combining like eating plan or like way of living that help us to improve us?
I'm sorry, I'm really hard here. Combining what?
Did you consider like combining an eating plan or like way of living that help us to improve our goals?
Yeah, I mean, I included the bone locator tool just because it was originally supposed to be an information page, but I didn't want to really bog anyone down with like text and paragraphs upon paragraphs of like a textbook thing. So I decided to go with this for a simple information section where people can kind of get oriented. But like I said, if I were to expand this, I would like to have a couple of different pages to teach people about, you know, where I'm getting this from, how this process was done, and, you know, where they could possibly learn more about the skull, etc. So.
No? I don't know what's happening, so.
I just can't
Got a
see
little
the
bit of
clock
time.
here.
You have 7 minutes.
Oh boy, I went fast. Any more questions in 7 minutes, guys? You're making standard for 7 minutes. Dan?
Curious what your decision-making process was for choosing various color schemes.
Various colors what?
Various color schemes for gradients of depth, the presentations on the wall. Just curiously know.
I actually didn't manipulate these colors, believe it or not. All of these colors that you see on the skull, I mean, this screen is actually a lot more purple than if you were to come up to the module. So it actually does kind of push things, it blows them out a little bit on here. But I actually didn't manipulate these colors, and that was, for me, the beauty of this project is that by simply putting a light within a skull that's actually cream colored, you come out with all of these warm chroma. I mean, it's like an explosion of color that comes out of that skull. And for me, as soon as I saw the experimental photographs that Lyman did almost a year ago, that was the most inspirational thing I'd ever seen. And for me, that was something that could really teach people is just the color that comes out of that. And wow, like I put my flashlight up to my hand before and I see how it kind of turns red, but whoa, my skull does that. Like who knew? So that to me was just really exciting. Yes.
Just an additional comment. Standardizing color between computers is a problem that I'm facing all the time when I edit slides and that sort of thing. So yeah, and hopefully we'll come up with a foolproof solution to that one. But yeah, I'm perfectly aware that she has color shifts and that sort of thing. But those are the colors
They're
that come,
real.
that,
And as
that
soon
come
as you
through.
put it up in the lab, I mean, you can see it. And we actually have a Lazy Susan setup that we use to kind of get that rotation. So it's like a nightlight. A really, really, really cool nightlight that I really want. Kind of want all of them, but maybe one day. I'm not sure who's first. I think it might have been
Ladies first.
And you have so many branches, and Amanda brought up a good point too about the process, which is one huge part of this.
Yeah.
The other thing is, and then of course you have the skull, which is, you know, as you mentioned, for diet, region, race, etc. And then you also have the anatomy lesson, so to speak, of the brain, types of fractures, what can happen. And I don't think I will dwell on, because you know, you can get, I have horses, and you can get knocked by one of them, and next thing you know, you have something crazy going on.
Yep.
So too many variables. But another point that might be interesting, another point that might be interesting. I should have hit the nail on the head. Another thing would be move off of, once you get all that kind of figured out and can deal with what you want to do, maybe to move into things where other fractures, hip fractures, why are certain regions breaking in the body, and either in developmental, children developing, playing sports versus geriatrics, what's going on there. Now obviously, you know, I don't know how you can really get into the hip without doing something very tiny.
We actually were talking
Into
about
little
scopes, and putting scopes into hollow femurs if we can find them, and putting scopes into marrow cavities of bones that are not living anymore. So
Try cadaver.
yes,
What kind of
yeah,
nest do you have?
we've been talking about that. We've been talking about the process of osteoporosis and maybe showing somebody a 10-year-old hip, and then the progression from a 10-year-old hip into a 75-year-old hip. so they can press a button and see that progression and see how the bone deteriorates over time. That's one of the things we've been talking about. Yeah, we have a couple of different ideas that we really want to play with and animate and show people how these things happen, because I feel like the common conception for a lot of people is that the skeleton is a skeletal frame for your body that doesn't move. It's, you know, a rigid structure that everything else comes off of, and it's dead and it's dense, but really your bones feed your body, and the more you feed your bones and you're treating them right, the more, I mean, they produce your blood, they produce hormones, they produce things that help you survive. So the premise that I wanted to get across to people is that your skull is alive and your bones are alive, and that they need protection, because they're not there simply to protect you and the soft things in you. They're there to feed you. Yes.
Well, I had a twofold question. I mean, that kind of goes into it is, you know, would you see another application for this type of, like, with other types of bones as well? You know, and also take away the point that, you know, the bone, you know, in anatomy physiology textbooks, often when you find the bones, you know, when they talk about bones, they don't really speak about them as just the bones.
Right.
It's an organ of the body.
Yeah.
You know, it's a living piece.
Yep.
Now, one of the questions I had, I guess it's kind of for Emily and for yourself, but I'd like you to answer it mainly.
Okay.
So, being the biomedical artist coming here and Lyman coming from the research side and the science side, what did you bring to the table in this project? So Lyman had the scope, was, you know, experimenting with lights and was, you know, seeing what it can do,
Yeah.
and then you came in. So what was your contribution on that side from the artistic, from being a scientific illustrator?
Well, when
side?
I first
What did you bring to the table?
When I first saw the pumpkin skulls, which is what Lyman was calling them, which is what I love, who can resist a pumpkin around Halloween time? But I really wanted to perfect that process, and Lyman and I really talked a lot about how can we get the best visual image out of that as we possibly can. And I don't know if you had experience photographing in the dark, but it's not easy. It's not particularly the most fun. So there was a lot of weeks where we just went in there and we're like, okay, let's see if this works, let's see if this works. And it was a lot of me playing with the camera, me trying to figure out, you know, what aperture do I need in order to get, you know, what shutter speed do I need in order to capture that moment where the light comes through the skull and where I'm not getting, it's as if I were to take a picture of someone standing in front of the window and all you see is that light coming into the camera's eye, but you're getting a dark face. So for me and for Lyman, the challenge was how do we get the best, most vibrant image while shooting in the dark? And it was not easy, but it was a lot of fun. And then also for me was how do I teach people with this? Like how do I make this understandable for a lay audience? How do I make this understandable for a med student or a 15-year-old football player or my mom? Or, you know, someone that might not necessarily know everything that Lyman and I know about the skull, or that us biomedical illustrators know because we've taken anatomy so many times and we understand the skull as an organ system, not just a bone. Because bone to me doesn't even really cover it anymore. It's more an organ system to me. So that was really my challenge as a biomedical illustrator, was how do we take this scientific concept and explain it to people and disseminate it in a way that makes sense visually without medical jargon or something that would